that model came from. And I suppose what one saw in a lot of those stories was a growing awareness of people's, in themselves, of their interests and their strengths, also of their own weaknesses and things they wanted to do something about, and a very strong interplay between their choices and what was going on in the rest of their lives. I'm not going to talk about the prisoners much today, but for them even more so, and particularly repairing the damage of their family relationships. I suppose what comes out of that study, when you start talking about, well then, who helps with that stuff, and is exactly the same as what I've seen when I've looked in the workplace of what people say about careers, is people say they want someone to sit down and talk to. And it's very interesting that the word sit down, there's something about sitting, isn't there? And you feel that cup of tea is heavily in brackets. You know, if you do this in England, it is like sit down, brackets over a cup of tea, and properly talk to me. And I just think the way people say that is so interesting. And it's exactly the same as what people say at work. So really, what people want is some time. They want to take some time, and they sometimes feel that someone else giving them some time is really what career support is about. And that is a quote. We didn't have many people in our biz study who had something productive from formal career guidance, but the blue words are from someone who had and was reflecting on it and said, I think it's a bit of time actually. It's a bit of time with a few tools to try and motivate people. And they had a bit of time, but they'd also had a little interest inventory and some quite simple things. But it was the fact that that was in the context of someone actually taking the time for them to say out loud and work through some of what they wanted to. And in any workplace, you would find people saying the same thing. If you unpick it a bit more, there were a lot of people in that study, and again I've seen exactly the same in the workplace, who were asking the labour market question, what's out there? But they nearly always add, for someone like me. Not just what's out there. So all these massive directories of jobs aren't really what people want. They want to know, for someone like me, this is a non-rhetorical question coming up, what does someone like me mean? When people say that, like me in terms of...
A whole range of things,
like,
gender, age, class,
yeah,
educational attainment.
yeah, stuff I've done before. It's a very complex context, isn't it? But they don't just want to know, well, you could become one of these, you know. If you were, they're almost saying, if you were me, sometimes. If you were me, what sorts of things might you be thinking about? Some people really want to know what they're good at. And in particular, they want to know what they're good at relative to other people. We have ideas about what we're good at. But particularly when you're an adult, what matters is finding something you might be as good at as other people are, or even better than some other people, and then you're really onto a winner. Something I'd enjoy, as I said before, is very high. Some people just don't know where to start at all. My children can't be the only children who say, well, career services are very good if you know what you want to do. But if you don't have any idea what you want to do, that's really hard. And I think some people don't know where to start with the process. In the biz study, there were a couple of more specific things. One was that some people wanted to get qualified and were very blocked through cost and time. Except, of course, the prisoners. So the top tip if you want to get free education is to go into prison. I've also been working with the military this year, and the army is quite good too. So, you know, that's a new life strategy. Get yourself in clink and get your degree. Some people wanted to move into a new area, may even know what area they wanted to move into. There was one very interesting woman in the study who'd had a whole run of jobs in the sort of machinery leasing sector. And she was very bright, she got promoted wherever she went. And after about 10 years, she thought she'd like to do something different. And she realised she had no idea how any other sector worked. That was quite a small sector, everybody knew everybody. She got headhunted. I don't think she'd ever had to apply for a job. Her dad got her first one, and after that she was good, and so people said, well, come work for us. But you realise that people like that, who on paper look very successful, have understood exactly how one little area of our economy works. But she didn't know how to even start looking at what other parts of the economy she could work in. If you asked her about transferable skills, she could rattle that off. This isn't someone who doesn't understand what she can do. She just doesn't understand what jobs there are, how they're got, you know, who you'd approach, the whole shooting match of sort of career tactics. Does that sound familiar? So, second non-rhetorical question. Actually, I think I may have this. No, let's. Does that look familiar to you? That sort of, that kind of map? Are there really big things you see with adults that aren't anywhere on that map? I'm sure there's lots of things. What are some of the biggies for you too?
Can I just toss in a word?
Yes.
Getting into a new area.
Yeah.
For me, that means reinventing oneself.
Yes.
And reinvention of oneself is something that maybe one needs to pick out a little
Yes.
bit more.
Yes.
Because that's what one needs to do in relation to new aims, new contexts, these new areas you're talking about that we may not know much about. The reinvention of oneself is a constant, lifelong, I think, requirement.
Yes, and I think sometimes people don't know whether they really have to change, or whether it's just the way they're putting themselves across to others. So that woman I gave the example of, she was a very flexible person. She probably didn't need to reinvent herself.
Yeah.
She needed to sort of shape a slightly different identity.
Represent.
But she represents is perhaps closer to what she really needed to do.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So I think just what these transitions are like for people is very interesting. The prisoners, many of them, had to completely reinvent themselves, because they're almost like starting again, and a lot of people in between. But yes, that sort about, people don't use the word transition in normal life,
No.
but that is what they're talking about.
Absolutely.
And I just want to say something about employers. This may be less familiar to you. I realise, was that you coughing? Having asked you to cough when it's time for me to stop, could you clap when it's time for me to stop? Otherwise, every time you cough, I think, oh crikey, have I already? Yeah. I just want to say something about what's going on with employers, because it's really interesting. Do we have any employers in the room, or people who work in large organisations? It's a shame because you've got Rolls-Royce up the road who do this stuff almost better than anyone, I often think. But there's a funny story in employers, particularly at the moment in larger employers, and it goes a bit like this. They don't really like career stuff very much. So, really for the last 20 years or so, they've been sort of sticking their fingers in their ears and looking the other way to a degree. They don't really think it's necessary, career stuff, quite a lot of the time. We had all that ridiculous stuff in the 1990s about people managing their own careers, all the Bridges books, all that rubbish about, job shift. And we had Handy, who, because he had a portfolio career himself, thought everyone else was going to have them. They're very nervous about expectations. Expectations is a really dirty word in the workplace, because if people expect more and we can't deliver it, then what happens? So if we help someone see that they could do more, but we can't offer them that opportunity, then that leaves us in a very uncomfortable place. Although we also then worry about retention. I'll come back to that again in a minute. But we're not sure if it's worse to talk to people about careers and they may get up themselves and leave, or is it worse that we don't talk to them about careers and they may leave anyway? We'll have another look at that with some different data. They don't have anyone to do career support anyway, so what's the point in even thinking about it? They have hammered their own HR functions if they were ever for that. They do outplacement, and they've never really stopped doing outplacement because that's sort of a social necessity. But let's not confuse outplacement with career support. You know, that's in very specific circumstances. It's also always seemed bizarre to me that we only get career support when we're being sacked. So that is really weird, isn't it? And in a way, they've said, well, we've got stuff online. So their intranets are cluttered with all sorts of stuff about jobs and procedures. And most of the stuff about jobs is stuff in the terms that HR people define jobs, which is long lists of skills and competencies and so on. They're job descriptions and skill descriptions, and they're quite useful when you're selecting somebody or training somebody. They don't tell you what you want to know if you're thinking, could I do that job? You know, competencies are only some of the things you need to think about, and they're way too long and they're too fiddly, so you read 10 and you think, oh, for heaven's sake, this isn't helping me. And they're very hard to find anyway. So the whole business of saying, well, we can shove stuff up online hasn't really helped much. So we've been there for a long time. But there's some interesting things that have been happening recently. One of them is talent management. Who knows that? Talent management? This is the field I'm supposed to work in, but I haven't ever quite decided what it means. But loosely, after that long period of sort of forgetfulness, employers discovered there were all sorts of jobs they couldn't fill very well. The UK labour market is notoriously fickle. And so you want to appoint a senior person or a skilled person, and you find you haven't got any. And you find if you go to the market that you can get applicants, but they're not very good either. There's no guarantee you're going to get someone turn up that you want. And it's led employers for the last 10 to 15 years, really, on a massive crusade to think about, so how do we develop people better so that when we have a job that's tricky to fill, we've got someone fairly ready to fill it. This is succession planning. This is biblical age. This is most of what Shakespeare is about. But, you know, we do give it a new name and think it's new. They're getting very interested not just in managers, but in professionals, and also in things that they're often calling critical roles, which might not be senior or highly skilled jobs at all, but they're very essential to run a business. And as more sectors are regulated, you find that if you haven't got people that the regulator says you need, you can't do the work. You have to shut it down. So there's been interesting stuff going on there. There have been things called talent reviews, where managers sit down, look at a lot of people and think, well, who have we got that we could put a bit of effort into and develop towards this kind of stuff? And before you know it, you're talking about potential. You're thinking about what do people have the potential to do that they're not doing now? And potential, is it not about careers? Isn't it careers we end up with when we start down this route? I did some work with a lovely woman at the European Parliament called Erica Landy, a linguist, but English is not her first language, so she uses English much better than any of us do. And we were supposed to be working on talent management in the European Parliament, which was an interesting experience. And she said, after we'd been working for a few weeks, I knocked at the door of talent management and found myself in the room of career development. And I thought, what an interesting woman she is. And she's quite right, that you start off saying, where's our next generation of wonderful linguists going to come from? And then you find yourself starting to think about, so if we had a young linguist then, what would we be doing with them? What would we be helping them to think about? What kinds of breadth of experience? That's careers. It's exactly careers. So talent has brought people back to careers, not necessarily for everyone, but for quite large slices of the workforce. Diversity remains a pressure on employers, and that's made them interested in the careers of different groups. Skills and deployment. Now I'm going to come to that last. Let's just go up to the top for a minute. Engagement. Who's come across engagement? You read the McLeod review. Engagement. Engagement is to employers like what employability is to further education. You know, it's kind of the new and loudest kid on the block. Engagement is about how we make people at work want to do it. kind of motivation really with a new name. And I think what people have discovered, again it wouldn't surprise you, is that if you look at the factors that make people say, I want to work here and I want to put a lot of effort into my work here, the kind of personal attention that people get if you talk to them about their careers is quite high on that list. So there's some very interesting connection between that sitting down and talking we talked about earlier, that kind of attention, and people wanting to really engage with their workplace. And I think that's about how personal the career stuff is. I don't know what you think that's about. I think it's about engaging with me as a person. And if you look at the kind of factors that people do stats on and correlate, one of the Gallup ones, which is widely used in a survey, is my supervisor or someone at work seems to care about me as a person. That's what career support. There's someone at work who encourages my development. In the last 6 months, someone at work has talked to me about my progress. This last year, I've had opportunities at work to learn and grow. Now, there are only 12 statements that they correlate with engagement. I've just read you 4, and they're all, to my ears, fairly career-related. There are others that are not so career-related. So when you look at huge samples across industries of the kinds of questions that if you say yes correlates with your high engagement in what's happening at work, you get that sort of stuff. And this isn't just for the highly skilled and the senior, that's for everybody. That applies to the most junior shop floor member of staff in a shop and so on. Which bits haven't we talked about? This is perhaps the one that's come to my attention really recently, which is a reawakening of interest in how we then deploy people well across businesses. We have people with all sorts of different skills. Organisations are still under pressure of trying to do a lot with not as many people as they would like. And so particularly if they're investing to a reasonable degree in developing people, they do then want to make sure that those people find their way into jobs where those skills are well used. And I think if I think about the things I expect employers to be interested in over the next few years, skill deployment would be very high on my list. And one of the things they've found is that the open job market is very inefficient. So most employers advertise things they're interested in you doing, and it's up to you to apply. Even if you're inside the business, you still apply. That's a very inefficient way of finding people who can do the job well, partly because shy people don't apply, partly because the one best person is invariably on holiday during the 2-week period it's up on the notice board. The really good people don't spend their lives looking at the job board, so they miss it. These are electronic boards, obviously. They miss it anyway. So that is not a very efficient system. So employers are looking again. So if we knew our people better, would we be able to have a better conversation with them about, well, this job's coming up over here. Would you be interested in applying? You'll still probably compete for it, but a much more overt role. Oh, the slides are telling me to move on, so I will. All that leads you to career conversations, and it's funny how fashionable career conversations have suddenly become in the workplace. Everyone's talking about having better career conversations. Isn't that funny? Having spent 20 years trying not to use the career word. This is a study done by Jonathan Winter and Charles Jackson at Career Innovation that looked at, this is 700 people in big organisations, and these were very high quality workers. They were identified as high performers. But they had lots of things they wanted to talk about at work that they couldn't talk about. The big conversation gap around their development was around their career development. So careers were one of the kind of unmet needs. And then just look at the last point there. The 40% of people who had something they wanted to talk about that they weren't talking about were 3 times more likely to be planning to leave. And that's what I meant when I said earlier, it may seem dangerous to talk about careers, but it's probably more dangerous not to talk about And these were valuable people. These were people that their businesses wanted to keep. So you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, but particularly you might be more damned if you don't. Told you I couldn't read from script. There's just going to be a few minutes while I turn over loads of pages. If you look at what people talk about when they're having a good conversation at work, a good career conversation, this is some old research I was involved with Jenny Kidd at Birkbeck and Charles Jackson at IES. I think the thing that still interests me about the stuff that people covered in conversations they said were effective is how wide they were. Look at the list of things that people were talking about. These are not conversations with career guidance professionals. These are conversations with people that they have found to talk to about their careers. And so any sense that the kinds of conversations that people have at work, if they can find someone to do that sitting down with them, that those are somehow narrower or more constrained or less depth than you would expect in a career guidance setting, I think is wrong. It's interesting and it's wrong. But not everyone finds these conversations, and not many times in our working lives do we have good conversations. But when we do, and they're not with a career professional, they're no less rich, complex, far-reaching, deep, personal than the kind of best conversation we'd hope for with a career professional. And it's interesting, when you do research and then you leave it for a number of years, a few things stay with you, and I suppose from that research, that's what's stayed with me. And the fact that someone said, I choose the person, not the hat. So this is about finding that person who you can talk to. Not because they're your boss, or because they're the HR manager, or because they're your friend at work. Not because of that role title they might have, but because of who they are